On a misty Halloween night in Mary Mead, laughter fades into screams when a body is found in the cornfield maze. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's tell me in comment. The annual Mary Mead Harvest Festival had always been the village's most charming affair, a gentle reminder that life, in all its simplicity, revolved around apple pies, knitted scarves, and gossip exchanged over cups of steaming tea. This year, however, a new attraction promised to make the event modern and lively. A Halloween Cornfield Maze, the pride of Mr. Percy Larkins, the wealthy landowner whose recent return from America had stirred curiosity and envy in equal measure. The villagers had been talking of little else all week. Posters with grinning pumpkins and twisting stalks had gone up outside the post office, and even the vicar had remarked, with mild disapproval, that Halloween was not exactly in keeping with English harvest traditions. Yet by twilight, the maze was filled with laughter, the sweet scent of roasted chestnuts, and the occasional shriek from those who had taken a wrong turn. Lanterns glowed in the darkening mist, and the sound of distant fiddles drifted across the fields. Miss Marple, bundled in a grey shawl, stood quietly at the maze entrance, her eyes moving from one villager to another. She was not fond of modern fads, as she called them, but she had accepted Mrs. Bantry's insistence that it would be quite the thing this year. Beside her, young Tommy Finch, the curate's nephew, offered her a cup of hot cider. "Rather a grand affair, isn't it, Miss Marple?" he said cheerfully. "It is indeed, my dear," she replied mildly, "though I always find that people reveal their truest selves when they think they're hidden in darkness or in disguise." Tommy laughed, not quite understanding, but Miss Marple's attention had already shifted toward the maze entrance, where a sharp argument had broken out between Mr. Percy Larkins and his much younger wife, Helena. Mrs. Larkins, beautiful and striking in her dark cloak, appeared furious. Her voice, though low, carried a tremor of indignation. "I told you not to bring her here tonight," she hissed. "You know exactly what people will think." Larkins scowled, glancing toward the crowd. "You're imagining things again. Helena, be careful what you say in public." A few heads turned their way before the couple disappeared into the maze, their lantern light swallowed by the tall, whispering stalks. Within half an hour, the laughter began to fade. A cold wind swept through the field, and fog rolled in from the hills. People began to call out to one another, some realizing they'd lost their way. Then, a scream cut through the night, sharp, terrified, and unmistakably human. It came from the very heart of the maze. The music stopped. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then came the rustle of hurried footsteps, shouts for help, and the faint flicker of lanterns moving toward the sound. Miss Marple, still at the entrance, drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began walking slowly forward, her face calm but her eyes alert. By the time she reached the center, a small crowd had gathered around what had once been the witch's hut, a prop meant to amuse the guests. Now, it had become the scene of horror. Mrs. Helena Larkins lay slumped across the straw-strewn floor, her pale face lit by the trembling flame of a fallen lantern. Her eyes stared wide open, fixed in a look of dreadful surprise. The villagers gasped and murmured. Someone sobbed. And at the doorway, Percy Larkins stood motionless, his hand still clutching the broken handle of his lantern, his face drained of all color. "She's dead," whispered Mrs. Bantry, crossing herself instinctively. "Oh, my poor soul, she's dead." The local constable pushed through the crowd, flustered and red-faced. "Everyone back, please. One touch anything." Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the scene. Her eyes lingered not on the body, but on the straw, the scattered bits of torn fabric, the pattern of footprints in the dirt. Then, almost absently, she stooped to pick up a small object, a silver locket, its chain broken, half buried beneath the straw. Inside was a photograph of another woman, smiling. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers closed gently over the locket. "A curious thing," she murmured softly, almost to herself. People so rarely lose the things that matter to them, unless, of course, they're trying to forget who they belong to. The constable's command for order did little to quiet the maze's uneasy breathing. Lanterns bobbed in nervous hands like will-o'-the-wisps, casting long, jittering shadows across the straw-strewn floor of the witch's hut. Percy Larkins remained rooted just outside the doorway, his mouth a thin, hard line. He did not look at his wife's body. He looked at the villagers, at their faces, at the way their eyes swelled with curiosity and judgment. A man who had made a fortune abroad understood markets. This, Miss Marple reflected, was the oldest market of all. Scandal, priced by the pound. Mrs. Bantry, a hand pressed to her throat, drifted near Miss Marple. "It is dreadful," she whispered. Helena did not seem quite herself earlier. So strained. "Did you see the quarrel?" "One sees many things when lanterns are fashionable," Miss Marple answered gently. She slipped the silver locket into a handkerchief inside her reticule, with a tact so natural it seemed accidental. "People imagine darkness is a curtain. In villages, my dear, darkness only makes the stage brighter." The constable, Mr. Brent, broad-shouldered and earnest, cleared his throat and attempted authority. "No one leaves the maze until we've taken names. Mr. Larkins, sir, if you would—" Percy Larkins lifted his chin. "You will have my full cooperation, constable, but I'll not be gawked at like a bear on a chain." He fixed his gaze on the hut, then quickly away. Helena was fragile. The fog, the lanterns. She may have stumbled. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the broken handle of his lantern and the fine, crescent-shaped scratch beneath Helena's left ear. There was little to suggest a fall, no blunt injury, no clumsy sprawl. Helena's hand, rather, lay elegantly crooked, as if she had reached for something no longer there. Beside her, a scatter of dark crumbs charcoal mingled with a faint smudge of rouge on the straw. A tiny thread of black velvet clung to a splinter near the threshold. From the crowd, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Hartley Payne, dabbed her eyes. "I warned against Halloween. It invites the wrong sort of spirits." "Spirits," murmured Miss Marple, "are very seldom worse than people, and even they borrow their perfumes." She had noticed it the moment she stepped in. A fashionable violet scent, not Helena's usual crisp, lemony water that Mrs. Bantry once described as so modern, almost foreign. Violets belonged to someone else tonight. Tommy Finch, anxious and eager to be useful, hovered near the constable. "I can help, Mr. Brent. I know the maze paths. There's a service lane for setting the props. You wouldn't see it unless you knew to push through a particular panel." Mr. Brent turned. "A hidden way." "Not hidden, exactly," Tommy said, flushing under the attention. "But for the volunteers who set lanterns and reset the scarecrows." Mr. Larkins arranged it with the carpenter, Mr. Jobling, from Much Benham. Miss Marple's gaze slipped briefly to Percy Larkins. He, too, looked at Tommy quickly, sharply, then composed his expression. Mr. Larkins liked control, she thought. Control had slipped tonight. "Where was Mrs. Larkins last seen alive?" Mr. Brent asked, fishing a stubby pencil from his pocket. "Just before the first turn after the owl scarecrow," piped up Mabel Truitt, who ran the bakery. "She came through with that fashion lady, what's her name? The one who took the cottage at the end of Mill Lane." "Miss Iris Whitcomb," Mrs. Bantry supplied, as if producing an embroidered handkerchief. "The prettiest thing, with rather daring hats. She and Helena were inseparable these last weeks. I said to Mr. Bantry only yesterday." "We'll take statements, Mr. Brent interrupted, flustered by the chorus of recollections. "One at a time." A shrill cry spiked the air, and everyone started. It was only Edith Pluck, the dairy girl, who had stepped on a tangle of twine. But nerves, once awakened, seldom returned to sleep quickly. The lantern flames hissed and licked as fog pressed in. Somewhere, a cheap accordion wheezed its last note and fell silent. Miss Marple moved a little closer to the hut. It was the sort of construction children adore. A quilt of planks, twine, flapping burlap, and a papier-mâché kettle hung over a painted hearth. The broom in the corner had been placed for effect, but the straw at its base was crushed as if by a heel pivoting sharply. The prints about the doorway were a muddle men's boots, women's sensible shoes, and a delicate impression like a dancing slipper but with a sturdy half-inch heel. Not Helena's, Miss Marple thought. Helena preferred a higher, showier heel, which left a longer, more dramatic bite in soft ground. This impression was neat and practical, the sort of shoe a clever woman wears when she expects to be on her feet, moving quickly without attracting attention. She knelt slowly, because age makes even discretion creak, and pinched a grain of something dark from the straw. Not charcoal, after all. Burnt cork, the sort actors use for quick disguises. Near it, a fleck of gold leaf tinsel, perhaps from a lantern tassel. She remembered seeing a particular lantern earlier, trim with gold edging, swaying from the arm of Miss Iris Whitcomb as Iris laughed too lightly, perhaps at a joke that had not been made. "Miss Marple," Percy Larkins said, stepping closer. He had regained his voice and some of his composure. "If you have any sympathy at all, please persuade these people to go home." "I should never presume to manage a crowd, Mr. Larkins," she said, kindly. "Crowds manage themselves according to appetite, but grief is unfond of an audience. If there is someone you trust, have them take you to the house. It will be easier to answer questions once tea is warm and lights are steady." His jaw worked. "I trust no one in this village." Then, catching himself, "Except, of course, our vicar, Hartley Payne. And Mr. Brent, naturally. But I do not require tea. I require that you all understand Helena suffered fainting spells. She was anxious. I'd spoken to Dr. Penrith. He will confirm it. Anxiety seldom leaves scratches," Miss Marple replied, her tone no more than a soft cardigan laid across a chair. "Nor does it break a locket chain." He started, eyes narrowing. But before he could ask what locket, the constable called him for formal questions. Percy went, shoulders squared like a man walking under a load he chose, once, to carry. Tommy sidled back to Miss Marple. "Do you think there was someone else in the hut, my dear? In a village there is always someone else in the hut," she said. "The question is not who could have been here, but who felt they had a right to be unseen." They walked the short ring around the witch's hut. The side panel burlap tacked over thin laths had a looseness to it. A child's hand could have pushed through. So could a woman's careful palm. Miss Marple touched the edge and felt a smear grease from a lantern, mixed with something powdery. Burnt cork again. She examined the ground and found, half hidden in crushed stubble, the stub of a paper program advertising the maze's midnight surprise. The time was smudged out by an oily thumb. "Miss Marple," a voice floated through the fog. Iris Whitcomb appeared, her hat a charming tilt of velvet and feather. In the lantern glow, her cheeks were flushed, and if one were inclined to be uncharitable, blotted just so where a hasty hand might have wiped at powder. "They said, Helena, oh, heavens, may I sit? I'm so light-headed." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, and made a little place for her on a dry patch of straw. She lowered herself beside the younger woman with the weightless air of a nurse who has seen every sort of faintness. "You were with Mrs. Larkins earlier?" "Yes, for a turn or two." Iris glanced toward Percy, then away so quickly one might think she feared catching his eye like a cold. "We lost each other near the owl scarecrow. The fog, well, it does things to one's sense of direction." Miss Marple nodded. "Fog does that. So does quarreling. To forgive an old woman's curiosity, do you favor violet perfume?" I noticed the gentlest hint. Iris's fingers flew to her throat. "Oh yes, a small atomizer. From Paris." She tried a tremulous smile. "You've the nose of a bloodhound, Miss Marple. Only a memory for simple things," Miss Marple said. One remembers a cake by the spice, a person by the scent. Her hand patted Iris's wrist light, reassuring, and not at all grandmotherly in what it felt. There was a faint, sticky residue, not perfume, a stage grease of some sort, the kind theatricals used to set a quick effect. Miss Marple had once known a girl in the church pantomime who could smudge a moustache in 10 seconds flat and wipe it off in 5. Mr. Brent called for everyone's attention again and began to shepherd people into small groups for statements. The maze, obedient now that it had frightened itself, yielded a damp corridor of silence. As Miss Marple rose, she noted a final trifle. On the bristle of the witch's broom, one long pale hair, torn not by wind but by a sudden jerk. Helena's hair was dark as a raven's wing. Iris Whitcomb's was a cool, fashionable ash blonde. Many small things, she reflected, are only small until one places them beside each other. Then they begin to speak. And tonight, in the hush between lantern breaths, the maze itself seemed to be whispering of a hidden panel, of violet in the wrong place, of a locket's broken chain, and of a woman who thought darkness would make her unseen when it merely sharpened her outline. By the following morning, the fog had thinned to a soft veil over Mary Mead, and with daylight came a different kind of chill, the sort that follows a night of horror. News of Helena Larkins's death had spread as swiftly as the mist itself, rolling from cottage to cottage on the tide of gossip and speculation. Some said it was her heart. Others whispered darker things, about jealousy, or curses, or even the price of fortune made too quickly. But in Miss Marple's neat sitting room, where the smell of lavender polish hung comfortingly in the air, conjecture gave way to quiet thought. She sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. On the table beside her lay the silver locket, cleaned and glinting faintly in the morning Sunday. The photograph inside a woman with dark, laughing eyes did not match Helena's face. Miss Marple had spent enough time among village women to recognize that photographs, like words, are rarely accidental things. Someone had lost this deliberately, she thought. Or perhaps someone had hoped it would be found. A soft knock came at her door. When she called for the visitor to enter, young Tommy Finch stepped in, hat in hand and face earnest. "Miss Marple," the constable asked if you might come to the Larkins' house. "They're taking statements, and, well, Mr. Brent says you were closest to the scene when it happened." "Closest, perhaps," she said mildly, rising. "But not nearest in understanding, I suspect. People see what frightens them first, not what is true." They walked together through the damp lanes toward the grand Larkins residence on the edge of the village. The house, though modern, had the unhappy air of something built too fast and loved too little. Curtains were drawn, and a single constable stood outside, pacing the gravel drive. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cologne and burnt paper, as if someone had hurried to destroy correspondence. Percy Larkins sat rigid in a high-backed chair, eyes shadowed, fingers restless against his knee. "I told them," he said as Miss Marple entered. "It was an accident. Helena was unwell. She had been fainting. Dizzy spells, you can ask Dr. Penrith." Miss Marple regarded him with calm politeness. "Quite so, Mr. Larkins. Though I wonder, do fainting spells usually leave bruises shaped like fingers upon the neck?" He froze. "I beg your pardon." Before he could say more, the door opened and Iris Whitcomb entered, her pale face composed but her eyes glinting with strain. She wore mourning black already, as though she had expected tragedy to follow her. "I came to pay my respects," she said softly, but Percy turned away sharply. "Respect?" His voice cracked. "You think I don't know what people are saying? That I quarreled with her? That—" Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the rising heat. "Forgive me, but the village rarely confines itself to one story at a time, Mr. Larkins. There is talk enough to fill 3 books and a sermon." She looked between the two. "Still, I find it odd that Mrs. Larkins was heard arguing with you just before she entered the maze, and yet, Miss Whitcomb, you followed her moments later." Iris's smile faltered. We lost each other. I thought she'd gone ahead." When I found the hut, she was already. She shivered delicately. Oh, it was dreadful. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her eyes missed nothing. I do believe it was, but I must ask, was it you who left your lantern in the hut? My lantern? Iris blinked. No. Mine was trimmed with gold tassels. I lost it in the fog. Ah. Miss Marple's tone was light, but a small click sounded in her mind, one piece settling quietly beside another. The gold tinsel she had found was no stray decoration. It was evidence, glowing faintly in her memory like a path through the corn. The constable cleared his throat. Doctor, Penrith's report will be ready by afternoon. He says there's bruising, not deep, but definite, and something under her nails, black residue of some kind. Burnt cork, Miss Marple murmured before she could stop herself. When both turned toward her, she smiled sweetly. A trick of the theatre, my dears. One can make a man out of a woman with a bit of cork and nerve. I remember a pantomime once. Neither Percy nor Iris spoke, but the silence between them thickened like smoke. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she glanced again at the locket resting in her palm. She had meant to ask Percy about it, but thought better of it now. No. She would first see Mrs. Hartley Payne, who had a gift for remembering every romantic entanglement within 50 miles. And perhaps, she mused, a visit to the maze by daylight, for things hidden in darkness often blush to be seen when the sun returns. Outside, she paused at the garden gate and looked back at the house. Behind the curtain, she could see Iris Whitcomb leaning close to Percy, whispering something urgent. His face twisted with anger, then fear. Miss Marple sighed softly. Human nature, she thought, is much like a maze, winding, secretive, and so very fond of leading people back to where they least wish to go. By afternoon, the fog had fully lifted, revealing the maze as an ordinary tangle of flattened stalks and damp paths. What had seemed eerie and endless by lantern light was now merely untidy, trampled straw, torn bunting, and the hollow remnants of last night's excitement. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge with her parasol and sensible shoes, felt the field had not finished speaking. Daylight only changed its tone. Constable Brent followed beside her, his notebook in hand, and his expression a mixture of humility and mild irritation. Dr. Penrith confirmed your suspicions, Miss Marple. Mrs. Larkins didn't faint. Strangled, not forcefully, but with precision. The doctor says whoever did it knew just how long to press. Miss Marple nodded, eyes scanning the ground. That suggests control, Mr. Brent. Passion leads to chaos, but calmness, that's the province of someone accustomed to getting their way quietly. He scratched his chin. Her husband, you mean? Perhaps. But men of business are rarely so tidy in their temper. She stooped to examine the earth near the collapsed witch's hut. Someone had placed a fresh plank over the gap in the side panel. Beneath it, pressed into the soft soil, was a heel mark, small, neat, identical to the one she had noticed the previous night. Tell me, she asked lightly, was Miss Whitcomb's statement taken? Brent flipped through his pages. She claimed she got lost in the fog and never reached the hut. Says she went back to the cider stall. Mabel Truitt saw her there a few minutes later. Convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And the time between the scream and her reappearance? 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5. Enough to vanish and return if one knows the shortcuts, she said softly, glancing toward the hidden maintenance lane Tommy Finch had mentioned. She moved toward it now, lifting her skirts slightly from the damp straw. The path was narrow and half concealed by the drooping stalks. Ah, yes, she murmured. Children would love this. Following her, Brent stumbled over a discarded object, a broken clasp, thin and golden. Miss Marple took it from his hand, studying the faint traces of violet powder along its edge. Lantern tassel, she said. The same gold as Miss Whitcomb's. It must have snagged when she brushed through here. Brent looked uneasy. You think she followed Helena? I think she meant to find her alone, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild as ever. But whether to comfort or to confront, that's another matter. They emerged near the far end of the field, where the fence bordered a small pond. Here, the reeds stirred faintly, and something gleamed between them. Miss Marple leaned forward, retrieving a soaked scrap of fabric black velvet, torn cleanly at the edge. The stitching was fine, the kind a woman might choose for an expensive cloak. She folded it carefully in her handkerchief. By the time they returned to the village, the autumn sun was sliding low, turning every window pane into a patch of gold. At the vicarage, Mrs. Hartley Payne awaited them with visible excitement. I was just about to call on you, Miss Marple. I've remembered something most curious, really. You see, Miss Whitcomb was not new to Mary Mead. She spent a summer here years ago as companion to a Mrs. Hewson, who lived then in that very same cottage at Mill Lane. Terrible scandal it was. A broken engagement, whispers of money gone missing. It all vanished when the lady moved away. Miss Marple listened without comment, her eyes half closed. And did Mrs. Hewson's fiancé happen to be? Why, none other than Percy Larkins, Mrs. Hartley Payne said triumphantly, though it was all hushed up at the time. Miss Marple rose. How very enlightening. People often believe they've escaped their pasts simply by repainting the walls. That evening, the village slept uneasily again. But Miss Marple did not. She sat by her fire, studying the locket once more, now certain of what the photograph represented, not a wife, but a memory. A woman wronged, perhaps, or one who had once held Miss Larkins's affection before losing it to someone more fashionable. And Iris Whitcomb, returning under a different name, had chosen her moment with theatrical precision. A knock startled her from her thoughts. Tommy Finch entered breathlessly, holding a crumpled note. Miss Marple. Mr. Brent sent me. He found this in the ashes of the Larkins fireplace. Thought you should see. She unfolded the half-burned paper. It was a letter, written in a woman's hand, elegant and firm. If she attends the maze, I will have my answer at last. You've deceived me twice, Percy. There will not be a third. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew faintly sorrowful. Ah, she said quietly, it is always the same story in every century, hearts broken in private, revenge taken in costume. The setting merely alters to suit the fashion. She looked toward the window, where the moonlight gleamed faintly over the empty fields. Tomorrow, she murmured, we shall visit the cottage at Mill Lane. I believe the truth has been waiting there all along, quite patient, like an old ghost who never learned how to rest. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, the village wrapped in that deceptive calm that so often follows tragedy. The mist had burned away, leaving the hedgerows glistening and the distant fields silvered by dew. Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in her shawl, walked with Tommy Finch along the narrow lane toward Mill Cottage, the one now occupied by Miss Iris Whitcomb. The young curate's nephew carried himself with a sort of nervous curiosity, his eagerness tempered by the unsettling sense that he was walking beside someone who always knew more than she said. I don't understand it, Tommy confessed. If Miss Whitcomb truly was involved, why return here at all? Surely she'd avoid a place with such history. Human beings, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, are not so tidy in their hearts. Guilt draws one back as often as love does. People wish to confront what haunts them, or control it. Sometimes, alas, they do both at once. Mill Cottage appeared ahead, quaint and quiet beneath an old willow tree, its thatched roof patched with moss. The garden was wild but cared for, a contradiction that pleased Miss Marple. Iris Whitcomb answered the door herself, dressed impeccably even in morning black, her expression carefully measured. Miss Marple, she said softly, I wondered if you might come. I haven't been able to sleep. Everything feels unfinished. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Unfinished things do have a way of troubling the mind. May we step in for a word? Inside, the sitting room was charming lace curtains, gleaming china, and the faint scent of violets that clung to everything. But beneath the sweetness lingered something harsher, the acrid ghost of smoke. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the small grate, where faint grey flecks still clung to the andiron. "You've had a fire early in the morning," she remarked mildly. "An unusual hour for burning papers." Iris's eyes flickered. "Just old notes. Things from before. I didn't wish to look at them anymore." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as a sigh. "Memories can be so untidy. They clutter the present if one lets them." She looked around the room. "This cottage must hold many memories for you, Miss Whitcomb, or should I say, Miss Iris Hewson." The younger woman froze, colour draining from her face. For a moment, only the faint tick of the mantel clock filled the silence. "You know," she whispered. "I suspected," Miss Marple said kindly. "You see, Mary Mead forgets very little. Though it forgives, rather, easily. When Mrs. Hartley Payne recalled your name, the rest fell into place. You returned under another one, perhaps hoping to see whether old wounds had truly healed." Iris sank into a chair, her composure slipping like a mask. "I didn't mean to harm her. I only wanted him to face me to remember what he'd done. He left me years ago for Helena, promised me everything, then vanished. When I heard they'd moved back here, I thought." She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. Miss Marple's expression was compassionate, yet watchful. "You thought you might remind him of the promises he preferred to forget. Did he know who you were?" Iris nodded slowly. "I told him the truth last month. He swore Helena knew nothing of it, but I think she guessed. She followed us once there was a dreadful scene. She called me a liar, a schemer. I wanted to frighten her, not—" The sound of the garden gate clicking interrupted her. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. Through the window, she saw Constable Brent approaching, holding a folded paper. When he entered, he looked solemn. "Miss Marple, Miss Whitcomb, I've news from Dr. Penrith's office. The lab's examined that black residue from under Mrs. Larkins's nails. It's not burnt cork after all, it's grease paint mixed with soot, the sort used for quick disguises. There were traces on her collar, too." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then Helena struggled with someone wearing that paint, someone costumed for the maze, perhaps pretending to be one of the actors?" Brent looked uncertain. "There were 2 scarecrow masks unaccounted for when we cleared the field. Could be one of the volunteers. Or," Miss Marple said softly, "someone who wished to appear as one." Her gaze rested gently on Iris. "You did wear a black cloak that night, did you not?" "Yes," Iris whispered, "but I swear I never touched her. I went into the maze. Yes, but and lost my lantern and came out another way. I was angry, foolish, but I didn't." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Then who was she meeting?" "Someone Helena trusted enough to follow alone. Perhaps the same person who received that letter we found half-burned in Mr. Larkins's hearth." Iris's eyes widened. "You found it?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone feared what you might reveal and acted first to silence both a jealous wife and a dangerous past." Brent looked confused. "You mean Mr. Larkins?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "though not quite as directly as one might suppose." She rose, her expression pensive. "Miss Whitcomb, I would ask you not to leave the village tonight. By morning, I think we shall have our answer." As they stepped back into the pale daylight, Tommy turned to her, baffled. "You don't really think Iris did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "No, my dear. But I think she knows who did. And when fear meets guilt, the truth seldom stays hidden for long." That evening, the air in Mary Mead carried the uneasy quiet that follows a storm. Curtains twitched, lamps burned later than usual, and everyone seemed to speak in lowered tones as though the killer might be listening through the hedges. Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the flames flickering over her thoughtful face, a cup of tea cooling beside her untouched. On the small table lay the locket, the torn velvet scrap, and the burnt letter. Each object was small, ordinary, yet together they whispered of something intimate and deliberate. A soft tap sounded at her door. When she opened it, Percy Larkins stood there, hat in hand, looking pale and drawn. His usual self-possession was gone. The air of the confident businessman had given way to a man haunted by something more than grief. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" "Of course, Mr. Larkins. The hour is late for calls, but late hours often accompany troubled consciences." He winced, but stepped inside. "I heard the police have been asking about Iris, Miss Whitcomb," he said after a moment, his voice rough. "They think she might have done it. She didn't, you know. She could never." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "People are capable of quite surprising things, Mr. Larkins, especially when emotion clouds judgment. But please, sit. I wonder why come to me rather than the constable." He hesitated, staring into the fire. "Because you see what others miss. You always have. You spoke to me once about darkness making people think they're hidden. I think perhaps that applies to me as well." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me, then what was it you tried to hide?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Helena found the old letters from years ago, when I was engaged to Iris. She accused me of still loving her. Foolishly, I'd kept one. It was in my desk, purely sentimental. I thought Iris had changed her name, gone abroad. I never expected her to appear again. When Helena learned who she was, she threatened to expose everything, to ruin us both. I burned the letters to protect Iris's reputation." "Reputation," Miss Marple murmured, "a most fragile possession. But tell me, where were you when your wife died?" "I was searching for her," he said quickly. "She ran into the maze before me. I followed. The fog was thick. I could barely see. I heard a cry, ran toward it, and found her, already gone." Miss Marple watched him steadily. "And yet you held a broken lantern, Mr. Larkins, when others arrived. Strange, for a man who says he could barely see." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. "It fell when I tripped over the straw," he muttered. "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes, straw does catch light easily, and guilt even faster." The room was silent save for the ticking clock. Then, suddenly, he looked up, anguish sharp in his eyes. "You think I killed her, don't you?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that you watched her die." She spoke quietly, with neither accusation nor pity. "You came upon her too late, perhaps, or too soon. You saw the struggle, and recognized the hand that dealt it. That's why you've been protecting someone, though not, I suspect, out of love." He stared at her, his breath catching. "You don't understand. She was only trying to frighten Helena. It wasn't meant to go so far." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Miss Whitcomb?" "Yes," he whispered, burying his face in his hands. "Helena struck her first, called her a thief, a liar, and Iris pushed her back. There was shouting, confusion. Helena grabbed her cloak, and it tore. That's how Iris's velvet was left behind. Then Helena stumbled. I think Iris tried to help her, but her scarf tangled and she couldn't breathe. When I reached them, it was over. Iris was sobbing, begging me to say nothing. She thought they'd hang her." Miss Marple rose, her voice steady. "And so you burned the letter, hid the truth, and let suspicion fall where it might. You loved neither woman truly, but you feared scandal more than justice." He didn't argue. Only the sound of the fire filled the silence between them. "At last," he said hoarsely, "what will you do?" "I," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do very little, Mr. Larkins. I merely tidy up the truth. The constable, I believe, will find the rest." She reached for her shawl, moving toward the door. "If you truly wish to protect Miss Whitcomb, You might encourage her to speak before morning. Confession, when delayed, turns to rot, and rot always rises to the surface. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint sound of the church bell striking 9. Miss Marple looked up at the moon, thoughtful. In the maze of human hearts, she reflected, guilt and pity often walked the same path, and sometimes, only by following both could one find the way out. The night pressed heavily over Mary Mead, and though the village lay cloaked in silence, a restless current seemed to move beneath it, a tension waiting for dawn. Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat near her window, watching the faint flicker of the constable's lantern across the distant lane, where the Larkins' house stood like a dark wound against the pale moonlight. She had seen too many tragedies dressed as accidents, too many confessions that were only half-truths. And this one, she thought, still had another layer. People often lied to protect others, but more often, they lied to protect themselves from what they had already done. At 8:30 the next morning, a knock came briskly at her door. Constable Brent entered, his uniform dusted with autumn leaves, his manner grim. "Miss Marple, you were right. Percy Larkins came to me just after sunrise. He's told the same story he told you, that his wife's death was an accident, that Miss Whitcomb was trying to frighten her. But I don't buy it. There's something off. He says she fell. But Dr. Penrith insists the marks around her throat show pressure, not panic, controlled force. That doesn't sound like a stumble." Miss Marple nodded. "No, it doesn't. Mr. Larkins has a businessman's conscience, weighted, selective, and terribly afraid of scandal. But guilt, Mr. Brent, is a curious thing. It sometimes drives a man to confess the wrong sin." Brent frowned. "You think he's lying about the accident?" "Oh, I'm quite certain," she said mildly. "But not to shield Miss Whitcomb, I think. To shield himself, though not in the way one imagines. If you'll indulge an old woman's curiosity, might we take a short walk? I believe the maze has one more secret to give us before we're done." They reached the field. Just as the first week, sunlight spilled across it. The corn was flattened now, trampled by boots and the weight of the previous day's investigation. Yet Miss Marple moved with delicate purpose, pausing here and there like a bird pecking thoughtfully at crumbs. Near the witch's hut, she stopped and crouched, her eyes narrowing. "Do you see, Mr. Brent? The earth has been disturbed since yesterday." He bent beside her. "A footprint, small one, could be a woman's." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone almost tender. "And quite recent. The edges are damp, but not blurred by dew. Miss Whitcomb, perhaps, paying a farewell visit to her guilt. I rather expected she'd come." They followed the faint trail toward the hedge that bordered the field, where a small gap opened onto the lane. There, lying half-hidden beneath the withered stalks, was a piece of jewelry, a brooch shaped like a bird in flight, its silver wings tarnished with mud. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. "This belonged to Helena," she said. "I noticed it at the festival. She was wearing it when I saw her arguing with her husband. Curious, isn't it, that it should be found here, so far from where her body lay?" Brent's brow furrowed. "Then she came this way before she died?" "Or after," Miss Marple said softly. "Carried by someone who wished to make it seem she never left the maze alive." Brent stared at her, then at the brooch. "You think she wasn't killed there?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that the maze was only the stage. The real quarrel happened earlier, likely near this very spot. Helena was lured out here before the event began. Perhaps a letter, a whispered promise, a meeting to settle accounts. She would have come jealous, women always do. And then, a scuffle, a hand on her throat. Silence. The body was moved later, placed in the hut to make it seem part of the night's confusion. A clever plan, but not quite clever enough. Brent, it looked shaken. "Then it wasn't Iris." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, dear Miss Whitcomb's temper is fiery, but her courage is rather theatrical. She could scheme, Yes, but not carry out such cold arithmetic. No, this was a man's doing, and one who has rehearsed deceit for many years. She closed her eyes briefly. Mr. Larkins was not protecting Iris at all. He was protecting his own story and hers, for they were bound by a shared sin long before Helena's death. As they walked back toward the village, Brent stopped suddenly. Then why confess now, even falsely? Because he sensed the noose tightening, Miss Marple said simply. And a half-truth, you see, is often the last refuge of the guilty. It lets them feel noble while still hiding what they fear most. When they reached the green, they saw Tommy Finch running toward them. His face flushed. "Miss Marple!" "The maid at the Larkins' house, she's found something. A cloak, damp and torn, hidden under the stairs." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with calm certainty. "Ah," she murmured. "The missing piece. How fortunate. Mr. Brent, I think we'd best return at once, for if I'm right, the real murderer has been waiting for us to find it." And as she turned toward the Larkins' house, her steps were steady and unhurried, the quiet rhythm of a woman who already knew the ending but understood that, for everyone else, the revelation still had to be lived through. The Larkins' house seemed quieter than ever when Miss Marple and Constable Brent returned. The morning sun, pale and uncertain, fell across the gravel path and glinted faintly on the brass door knocker. Inside, the air was heavy with the faint scent of tobacco and damp wool, a house that had not yet decided whether to mourn or defend itself. Percy Larkins stood by the drawing-room window, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the garden beyond. On a chair nearby lay the cloak the maid had discovered, black velvet, still damp at the hem and torn cleanly at the shoulder seam. Brent crossed the room and lifted it carefully. "This matches the scrap we found in the maze," he said, glancing at Miss Marple. "The same stitching, the same cloth." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and more importantly, the same tear. You see, it was not cut. It was ripped by someone trying to free themselves from another's grasp." Her gaze drifted to Mr. Larkins. "Tell me, sir, have you worn this cloak?" He turned sharply, color draining from his face. "What? No, of course not. It's a woman's garment." "Quite so," Miss Marple said mildly, "but one might wear such a thing over the shoulders if one wished to pass unnoticed or to resemble a woman in the fog." Brent frowned. "You mean he disguised himself?" Miss Marple's tone remained calm, almost kind. "Perhaps not for long. Only enough to approach his wife without alarming her. Helena, I think, was expecting to meet Iris that night, but when she entered the field, it was not Miss Whitcomb who stepped from the shadows. It was you, Mr. Larkins, cloaked and careful, hoping to intercept her first." Larkins' eyes flashed. "That's absurd. Why would I—" "To stop her," Miss Marple said quietly. "To stop her from going to the constable the next morning. Helena knew you had deceived her, that your fortune was not built honestly but by manipulation abroad. She threatened to expose it. You feared scandal, not loss, so you arranged a meeting in the maze, knowing the fog and costumes would give you cover." He stared at her, breathing unevenly. "You have no proof." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the locket on the table. "But I do have motive, opportunity, and something you cannot quite explain. This locket, for instance, it was not your wife's. It belonged to Iris years ago. Inside, her photograph, and yet it was found beside Helena's body. You see, you dropped it there, intending to frame Iris when the police found it. But the clasp had already broken from your earlier attempt to open it. You could not have known that." A low murmur filled the room. Even Constable Brent, usually steady, looked unsettled. "Good heavens," he muttered. Larkins moved toward the fireplace, one hand gripping the mantel. His face was pale, his voice low but harsh. "You old woman, you twist everything. Helena was hysterical. She struck me, accused me of ruin. I tried to calm her, she fought me. I only meant to silence her, just for a moment. Until she listened. Then, She fell. The scarf. He broke off, pressing his fists to his temples. I never meant to kill her. Miss Marple regarded him gently, though her eyes were cold as steel. No one ever means to, Mr. Larkins. That is why murder so often wears the mask of accident. Brent straightened. You'll come with me now, sir. But Miss Marple lifted a hand. Not yet, Mr. Brent. There's one more person who deserves to be here, for truth is a mercy best shared. A knock came just then, as if on cue. Tommy Finch entered, followed by Iris Whitcomb. She looked drawn, eyes shadowed but calm. When her gaze fell on Larkins, she seemed both pitying and furious. So it was you, she whispered. You used me. You wanted me to think I'd caused it so I'd stay silent, out of fear. Larkins looked away. I saved you, Iris. If I hadn't, they'd have hanged you. Saved me, she said bitterly. You made me an accomplice to your lie. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. Yes, and that, perhaps, is the cruelest trick of all, to let another carry half of one's guilt. She turned to Brent. Now, I believe you may take him. Larkins did not resist. He merely looked back once, a man hollowed by what his hands had done. The constable led him out, the sound of their steps fading down the hall. For a long while, the room was silent. Then Iris, her voice trembling, said, How did you know? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because, my dear, no woman tears her cloak cleanly from the shoulder. That is the strength of a man and the folly of one who believes no one notices the difference. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, scattering the last of the cornfield leaves. The maze, now empty, stood still beneath the morning sun, a tangle of paths that, like the secrets of the heart, had finally led to their end. The news of Percy Larkins's confession spread through Mary Mead with the quiet speed of smoke through dry timber. By noon, everyone knew or thought they knew what had happened. At the butcher's, they whispered about his temper. At the vicarage, about his greed. And at the post office, Mrs. Bantry was already declaring it the most scandalous event since the vicar's niece had run off with an actor. Yet Miss Marple, walking back from the Larkins' house that afternoon, wore an expression not of satisfaction but of thought. Her sharp blue eyes were turned inward, as though following some invisible thread that others had failed to see. Tommy Finch, who had insisted on escorting her home, noticed her silence. It's over now, isn't it? He asked tentatively. Mr. Larkins confessed. After all, the village seems almost relieved. Relieved? Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. Truth, however, is seldom so tidy. It likes to leave crumbs along the way, little crumbs that say, look again. She stopped by the gate of her garden and regarded the roses still clinging stubbornly to bloom. Tell me, Tommy, when we found the brooch near the lane, why did it show no sign of blood or soil from struggle, though the ground was damp? Tommy frowned. I didn't think of that. Maybe the killer dropped it after? Or placed it there later, Miss Marple said. Which would mean someone wanted us to believe Helena had died where she did not. And Mr. Larkins, clever though he is, did not have time to return to the field that night, not after the crowd gathered. So who did? Tommy blinked. You mean someone else moved the brooch? I mean, she said gently, someone else was tidying up the crime. Guilt is not always solitary, my dear. That evening brought another visitor. Constable Brent arrived, looking puzzled, a paper in hand. Miss Marple, we've just finished searching Mr. Larkins's study again. Found this tucked in the back of a drawer, a bank draft for a rather large sum made out to Miss Whitcomb, dated only 2 days before the murder. Miss Marple took the paper delicately. Interesting. So he intended to pay her off, or perhaps she was blackmailing him. Either way, money always dirties the edges of affection. Brent nodded grimly. She swears she knew nothing about it. Says he forged her name to hide something else. But that's odd, isn't it? For a woman with nothing to hide, she's been very eager to pack her bags and leave town. Miss Marple's brow furrowed ever so slightly. Leave town, you say? Tomorrow morning, said she needs rest. But between you and me, she looks frightened rather than tired. When he left, Miss Marple stood for a long while by her window, thinking. Outside, twilight had descended in soft violets and greys. The maize field lay in the distance, still and harmless under the fading light. And yet something in her mind refused to settle. It was not simply guilt that clung to Iris Whitcomb, it was fear. The kind of fear that comes not from doing wrong, but from knowing someone else has. She found Iris at Mill Cottage just after supper. The younger woman sat by the fire, a small suitcase beside her chair. She rose quickly when Miss Marple entered. You've heard, then? About the confession. I suppose that means it's over. Over? Miss Marple repeated mildly. I wonder, for a woman who has been vindicated, you look curiously pale. Perhaps because you've realized, my dear, that a confession does not always equal the truth. Iris's lips trembled. He did it, Miss Marple. He admitted it. Yes, said Miss Marple, to killing his wife, but he did not say he planned it, nor did he admit to moving the body, and yet someone had the presence of mind to arrange that scene. Someone who knew precisely where Helena would be found, and how best to make it look like an accident. Iris sank into her chair. I was only trying to help him. After I found out what had happened, I panicked. He begged me to move her, said it would look better if it seemed she'd fallen. I thought I was saving him. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her gaze did not waver. Yes, you thought love demanded obedience, but obedience, my dear, is the cruelest chain of all when tied to a guilty man. Iris covered her face with her hands. I wanted to leave that night, but he said we must wait, that no one would suspect me if I stayed calm. But then you came, and you asked questions, and I knew you'd see it. You always do. Miss Marple reached out, laying a hand on her shoulder. You helped after the deed, but the fault was never truly yours. You were used, just as you were years ago. Percy Larkins was a man who arranged his life like a balance sheet, every secret accounted for, every heart a transaction. And yet, in the end, the smallest entry undid him a torn cloak and a foolish locket. Iris looked up through her tears. What will they do to me? That, Miss Marple said gently, will depend on whether you tell the constable before I do. Mercy, like justice, is best earned swiftly. She rose, smoothing her shawl. Come, my dear. The night is long, but dawn comes quicker when one has nothing left to hide. Outside, the air was cool and faintly sweet with the scent of fallen apples. The moon rose over the maize field, silvering its tangled paths, a silent monument to the folly of those who thought they could twist truth into something manageable. Miss Marple, walking beside the trembling Iris Whitcomb, allowed herself a quiet sigh. Human nature, she reflected, never truly changes, only the disguises do. By the next morning, the village had settled into that deceptive calm that always follows scandal, the kind that hums beneath polite conversation, like a note held too long beneath the melody. The maze was being dismantled, its broken stalks bundled into wagons, its garish decorations removed as if erasing the memory of what had happened there. But Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew, never truly forgot anything. It merely folded the past neatly into its gossip, like lace wrapped in tissue. She read in the Daily Chronicle that Percy Larkins had been remanded to custody, his statement formally recorded. The article praised Constable Brent's swift and decisive action. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Swift, perhaps, but decisive, not yet. She had seen justice stumble before when pity or pride got in the way, and something about Mr. Larkins's final words still echoed in her mind. I never meant to kill her. That phrase, so common, so easily uttered, often concealed more than it confessed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Tommy Finch again, looking rumpled but bright-eyed. Miss Marple, Mr. Brent, asked me to tell you they've found something in the Larkins greenhouse. He thought you might want to see. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the garden, misted with condensation. Inside, it smelled of damp soil and decay. Brent was already there, his cap in his hands, a puzzled frown creasing his brow. "We were checking the place before sealing the property," he said. "Found this behind one of the flower pots." He lifted a small bottle from a paper bag, clear glass, half filled with a cloudy liquid. "Dr. Penrith says it's chloroform. Old, but potent enough." Miss Marple peered at it thoughtfully. "Chloroform," she repeated softly. "How curious. That explains Helena's fainting spells and her sudden dizziness, perhaps. I think our Mr. Larkins had been testing his methods long before the night of the murder." Brent's eyes widened. "You mean he was dosing her?" "Not constantly," Miss Marple said, "but enough to keep her pliant, dependent, unsure of herself. He was a man who preferred control to conflict, but on that last night, control failed him as it always does in the end." They stepped out into the weak sunlight. Miss Marple walked a few paces toward the orchard, her steps slow but steady. "Do you recall, Mr. Brent, that Helena was seen carrying her shawl when she entered the maze? Yet it was never recovered. I rather think it's time we find it." The constable blinked. "You think he hid it?" "Not he," Miss Marple replied. "He was too busy creating the illusion of innocence. But someone else might have hidden what was inconvenient, someone who still hoped to shape the story, even after his arrest." They searched the garden quietly, their boots crunching over the frosted grass. Near the compost heap, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of pale fabric beneath a tangle of branches. She stooped and lifted it free, a silk shawl, torn and faintly stained. She examined the edge, where the threads had frayed unevenly. "Ah," she murmured. Blood and a woman's hair caught in the weave. Not Helena's dark brown, but lighter, ash blonde. Brent stared. "Miss Whitcomb's." Miss Marple nodded. "So it seems." They returned to Mill Cottage. Iris opened the door herself, her face ashen but composed. When Miss Marple laid the shawl gently on the table, Iris recoiled, as though from fire. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "when one covers up a crime, one must remember that fabric tells tales as surely as witnesses do. This shawl was yours, was it not? Given to Helena once, perhaps as a gesture of reconciliation." Iris swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "She came here that morning to gloat. She said Percy had told her everything, that I was nothing but a mistake he regretted. I slapped her. She pulled at the shawl, and it tore. I thought she'd tell him I struck her." Miss Marple's expression was gentle but unsparing. "And later, when you heard what had happened, you saw the tear and the stain and realized it would ruin your story. So you hid it." Tears welled in Iris's eyes. "I only wanted to make it stop, all of it. I wanted peace." "Peace," Miss Marple said quietly, "is a thing rarely earned by silence." At last, Iris nodded, defeated. "I'll tell the constable everything. I can't bear the weight of it any more." Miss Marple watched her go with quiet sadness. When Brent turned to her, she said, "You see, Mr. Brent, every murder has two victims, the one who dies and the one who lives with what they've done or concealed. The rest of us merely tidy the ruins." As the constable left to take Iris's statement, Miss Marple lingered by the cottage window, her reflection faint in the glass. Beyond, the cornfield shimmered in the pale morning sun, its paths flattened, but still visible ghostly traces of choices and missteps. She sighed softly. "Human nature," she murmured, "never ceases to make work for the likes of me." The confession of Iris Whitcomb sent a tremor through the village more profound than any before it. That the elegant, self-possessed lady of Mill Cottage had concealed evidence was enough to make even Mrs. Bantry forget her embroidery and hurry down to the vicarage to share the news. Yet Miss Marple remained strangely quiet. She sat by her fire that evening, knitting half forgotten in her lap, her eyes reflecting the slow dance of the flames. Something still troubled her, a thread that refused to tie neatly into the rest of the tapestry. Constable Brent arrived after supper, his boots leaving small, wet prints on the rug. "She's signed the statement," he said. "Admitted to hiding the shawl and to helping Larkins move the body. She claims she didn't know Helena was dead, at first thought she'd only fainted." He rubbed his forehead, weariness showing. "If that's true, she's looking at aiding and abetting, not murder. Still, it's a sad business." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Sad indeed. But do you not find it odd, Mr. Brent, that so many of these people were at the same place, at the same hour, and yet no one seems to have heard the moment of the crime?" He blinked. "You mean the scream?" "Precisely," she said. "The scream was heard by everyone, yet I am convinced it was not Helena's." Brent frowned. "Then whose?" "Patience, Mr. Brent. I should like to visit the maze once more, by lamplight this time. The darkness reveals what daylight politely ignores." By the time they reached the field, the wind had risen, rattling what remained of the cornstalks like dry bones. The witch's hut still stood, though half collapsed now, the straw darkened with dew. Miss Marple moved slowly, her lantern throwing long shadows across the uneven ground. "You see," she murmured, "where the straw lies thicker here. It was laid deliberately, after the fact, to disguise the drag marks. The body was brought back this way, but not by Iris alone. She is not strong enough." Brent crouched, squinting at the ground. "You think Larkins had help?" "Oh, yes," she said softly, "but not from Iris. From someone who owed him loyalty or money. Someone clever enough to follow orders, but not clever enough to question them." She lifted her lantern higher, eyes sweeping the perimeter. "Tell me, has the caretaker, Mr. Jobling, been questioned again?" Brent's eyes widened. "Jobling? The carpenter who built the maze?" "The very one. He was here early that evening, setting lanterns, and left late, or so he claimed. But I remember his wife mentioning that he'd been paid handsomely for extra work in recent weeks. Likely hush money for his assistance after the fact." Brent looked startled. "You think he helped move the body?" "Not think, no," Miss Marple said calmly. "Look here." She pointed to the hut's side wall, where faint smudges of grease streaked the planks. "Those are tool marks." He loosened the paneling, the same shortcut Tommy Finch mentioned. It would have allowed the body to be moved, unseen. Brent blew out a slow breath. "Good Lord. So Jobling helped Larkins stage the scene?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "But he didn't realize he'd left behind the most damning clue of all." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a metal button, dull with age. "I found this earlier, near the garden path behind the Larkins greenhouse. A carpenter's jacket button. When I questioned Jobling last week, I noticed his coat was missing one." Brent stared. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple." "Merely observant," she said gently. "People always tell you what they are, if you let them talk long enough. Now, we must act quickly. Jobling will hear of Larkins's confession soon enough, and frightened men make dangerous choices when cornered." The constable left at once to send word to his sergeant. Miss Marple remained behind for a moment, listening to the sigh of the wind through the ruined maze. It was strange, she thought, how human nature repeated itself endlessly, pride leading to deceit, deceit to desperation, and desperation finally to ruin. When she returned home, the hour was late. She sat again by her fire, the clock ticking softly beside her. There was a knock, hesitant but familiar. Tommy Finch stood there, flushed and breathless. "They've caught him, Miss Marple." Mr. Jobling tried to flee by the river. He slipped and fell in before they even reached him. They pulled him out. He's alive, but barely. "And he's talking." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "He will tell them what he was told to do, not what he saw. That, I fear, is beyond him now." Tommy looked puzzled. Then, Is it really over? Nearly, Miss Marple said softly. The law will have its ending, but truth has its own pace. It takes longer and costs more dearly. She turned to the fire, her knitting forgotten again. Outside, the church bell struck 10, each chime falling like a soft verdict over the village. In its quiet echo, she heard once more the whisper of the maze, that human labyrinth of fear, love, and folly, from which so few ever truly find their way out. Morning crept into Mary Mead like a slow exhalation, soft and pale, carrying with it the muted relief that followed the storm of confession and arrest. Yet, for Miss Marple, peace did not sit comfortably. She sat at her breakfast table, stirring her tea absently, the clink of the spoon marking the rhythm of her thoughts. There was still a faint unease in her mind, something about the arrangement of the pieces, about human behavior not aligning quite as it should. People, she often said, were predictable in their unpredictability. But when even that failed to follow pattern, something was wrong. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Constable Brent entered, looking weary but satisfied. Jobling confessed properly this morning, he said, admitted that Larkins came to him after the murder, asked his help to move the body, promised him £50 and a steady position at his new estate abroad. Said he was terrified to refuse. Miss Marple looked up. And what did he say about the lantern, the one that went missing? Brent frowned. Funny thing. He swears he never touched it. Claims Larkins handed it to someone else that night before calling him to help. Someone else? Miss Marple repeated softly. How very strange, and yet not so strange at all. She rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan. Mr. Brent, would you be so kind as to have the Larkins lantern brought here? The broken one, the handle snapped, if I recall. An hour later, the constable returned with the object, still streaked faintly with soot. Miss Marple examined it under the lamplight, turning it in her hands. You see, she said, tapping the glass rim. The soot pattern tells a little story. The smoke mark leans left as if held in a left hand, tilted slightly away from the face. Percy Larkins was right-handed, but our Miss Whitcomb, as I recall, is not. You mean she? I mean, Miss Marple said gently, that the final act of that wretched night was shared more evenly than either of them ever admitted. Percy began it, his anger, his grip, his cruel little plan. But when Helena gasped her last, Iris panicked, and in that moment of hysteria, she seized the lantern to light her way, perhaps, or to cover what she thought an accident. But the flames sputtered, the glass shattered, and in her confusion she left behind the very proof she later feared. Brent sank into the nearest chair. Then, she's guiltier than we thought. Miss Marple's tone was soft but firm. Not guiltier, simply more human. She did not kill Helena deliberately, but she watched a life end and chose silence. Her punishment began the moment she decided to keep that secret. They sat for a moment in quiet. The fire crackled faintly, and the clock on the mantel marked the slow passage of morning. Then Brent said, What will become of her? That, I think, will be for the court to decide, Miss Marple replied. But Mercy, I hope, will sit beside the judge, for she has already suffered what no prison could match, the knowledge that love turned to ruin under her own hands. Later that afternoon, the constable escorted Iris to the magistrate's office. She was pale, her composure frayed, but she did not resist. Miss Marple watched from her garden gate as they passed. Iris lifted her eyes briefly, and in that fleeting moment, something like gratitude or perhaps release passed between them. Then she was gone. The days that followed were gentler. The villagers, having gorged themselves on the story, soon turned their tongues to safer subjects: the weather, the vicar's sermon, the scarcity of good butter. The maze was cleared, the field returned to quiet dignity, and autumn folded softly into the first breath of winter. One evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window, Tommy Finch stopped by with a parcel of books and the latest gossip. They say the magistrate might recommend leniency, he said, perching awkwardly on the edge of the chair. Apparently, Miss Whitcomb helped recover the funds Larkins hid abroad. Enough, they say, to repay what he stole. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That will please the newspapers, I'm sure. They do so love when wickedness tidies itself. Tommy hesitated, then asked quietly, Do you ever grow tired of it, Miss Marple? Of seeing all this, the lies, the cruelty, the secrets? She looked toward the fire, her face calm but distant. No, my dear, because every lie, every cruelty, begins the same way with someone thinking they're different, that they can sin neatly, as one folds a napkin. But in the end, the creases always show. He nodded, thoughtful, and after a few minutes took his leave. Miss Marple remained by the window long after he'd gone. The moon hung low over Merry Mead, casting a silver sheen across the empty fields. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, an owl called soft, mournful, inevitable. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer, her gaze steady on the dark horizon. The world, she thought, would always turn to its quiet deceits, and she would always, in her small way, set them straight. It was not justice she sought, not entirely but understanding, and perhaps, in understanding, a little peace.